This Sentry video guide is going to teach you how to counter the Sentry with units from all three races. We're going to start with Protoss, then do Terran, and finally Zerg. So one good early game counter to the Sentry is going to be the Mothership Core. And the way this works is, imagine that you were trying to attack with some early Stalkers, but force fields were blocking the way. Mothership Core is going to be able to fly in and either chase the Sentry away or force the Sentry to kill. It's going to either kill the Sentry or make the Sentry run away. If the Sentry runs away, it's not going to be there to cast force field, and your Stalkers and Zealots can move into the enemy space. Another unit that works well for this purpose is the Oracle. Oracles can be used as a follow-up to early gateway pressure. Just a single Oracle is going to be able to fly in, pick off all the Sentries, and then your gateway units will be able to safely move up the ramp without getting force fielded. So later in the game, you might consider a Void Ray. The Void Ray itself is not particularly a true counter to the Sentry, but it's just a flying unit, and it's good against Stalkers too. So it has a little bit more flexibility than the Oracle, and it can be used as part of your later game composition. So see, the Void Ray itself is not particularly strong against the Sentry. The reason I include it is because the Void Ray naturally can fly over force fields, so it's good for force fielded units. The strong counters, not including like massive air units, naturally they're going to be good, is going to be the Colossi. So the Colossus is the strongest counter, really, especially once it gets extended thermal lance. You'll see that even if you force field, it doesn't really matter, because the Colossus will crush the force fields, and then the damage of the Colossus just wrecks the Sentry. So pretty strong counter there. Another good option is going to be the Archon. And just like with the Colossus, the Archon's going to crush the force fields. So that's how you counter it with the Sentry, counter the Sentry and force fields with Protoss. Next we're going to discuss Terran. Terran bio units don't really have a true counter. If force fields are poor, bio units with upgrades and medevac support can just engage directly with gateway units. But towards the late game, you might want to consider some other options. Basically, the real way to counter the Sentry is to just use a bunch of medevacs. So if you had some Sentries and they manage to trap in your bio units, you can just scoop them up and go back behind the force fields. And obviously if it was just Sentries, you could attack straight up. I'm saying if you were trapped in like this and the enemy's got a bunch of Zealots, just scoop your units up and drop them off behind the force fields. Sentry energy will be drained, and they'll have less energy for Guardian Shield and Force Field as soon as the force fields drop. Medevacs are also like a good unit counter to the Sentry, because if the Sentry is being defensive and blocking your bio units from moving up a ramp or into the base, you just pick up all your units and medevacs and drop them off in the main or the natural and just bypass the force field entirely. So really for bio, the medevac is a good option. Later in the game, once you have the tech, the Ghost works well too. And Ghost works for two reasons. One's going to be the EMP, drain all their energy. The Ghost also does bonus damage to light units, so it quickly burns through the Sentry. So that's good later in the game, if you're still on bio and there's lots of Sentries. And Ghosts are good against Archons and High Templar too, so they're nice to have. A mech is just strong in general versus the Sentry. You're not going to see many Protoss players loading up on Sentries against mech. And what you'll see is that the Sentries just don't even get in range. of siege tanks, they'll just get destroyed very easily. Even though they don't take they take a little less damage since they're light, they really can't touch the siege tank. Thors, same story. Thors also crush force fields, which is nice. You know, you can't block units in with the can't block Thors in with the Sentry is what I'm trying to say. I am playing this live as I'm talking, so it is a bit of a distraction. I mean, pretty much other battle cruisers are good against Sentries too, and you know, Hellions and Hellbats are okay. Like early in the game for early skirmishes, you can use Hellions, but later in the game, you know, I wouldn't consider them a counter just because the Hellions can be trapped by force fields. So it's like, even though they do good against sentries, if they get trapped by force fields, or in the case of the Hellbat, locked out by force fields, it's not, you know, something you can just mass to counter the sentry. It's really for mech, siege tank, and Thors do well versus the sentry. For bio, ghosts, and medevacs are the key. So that's it for Terran. We're going to discuss, actually one more thing I want to discuss is the Banshee. Banshees are pretty good against sentries. And what you'll find is if the opponent tries to be cheap with their sentries and just wants to get a couple for Guardian Shield, you can use some cloaked Banshees and sneak in and pick them off without, you know, with escaping attention. So it can be a good way for Bio Terrans or even Mech Terrans to pick off valuable units, set a couple cloaked sentries that don't even need upgrades. So that's going to be it for the Terran counters. We're going to finally discuss Zerg. One of the best ones is actually going to be the Swarm Host. Early Zerg units do not do good against sentries. And for example, Zerglings, while they might look like they do good, what you'll find is that players can use the sentry to make a wall, you know, around their sentries and kind of box themselves in. The Zerglings can't get in, and they'll die eventually, not exactly very quickly, but with lots of energy, the force fields can keep being refreshed. So, Zerglings are not a sentry counter for that reason. And the same thing with Roaches and Hydralisks, they just get trapped too easily. So, for example, let's take the same kind of army, and we'll add in a couple of these. And you can use Immortals to focus fire down the Roaches here. And it's just not a fair fight. So what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to stick to the first good unit is the Swarm Host, and it might be counterintuitive at first, but the reason is that it works so well is because the sentries just can't get close enough. They're too slow. And even if you try to force field these and let your stalkers take them out, you just burn through energy. Sentries really can't easily get around Swarm Hosts, especially Locusts, especially if the Locusts are on creep. And if you move the Swarm Host back, it's just no contest. You're going to lose. So, Swarm Host, very good in the early game. Very strong versus Immortal Sentry all-in attacks. Ultralisks are probably the best hard counter for the Sentry. And you'll see, even with overwhelming sentry numbers and cost, Ultralisks will just destroy them. They do run over force fields, no problem, and it's just a hard counter. So another option is, it's not really a true option, but Mutalisks can help. But what you'll find is that, you know, with Immortal Sentry all-ins, with a bunch of Zealots and Immortals, that's when the Mutalist shines. Because in a straight-up battle, Mutalisks aren't particularly good versus... they're not particularly good versus Sentries, but when it's, you know, a numbers advantage, you can then use the Mutas to pick off Immortals. And it's actually common for Zerg to try to counter the Immortal Sentry all-in by using Mutas in large quantities. So it is something I should mention. Broodlords are naturally going to be strong versus Sentries. I don't think you really need to see that. They have good DPS against ground units, so I'll show it anyway. We're in the videos already open. You know, sentries just have a really low HP pool. They just really can't do much against the Broodlord. And finally, I did want to mention one more counter, and it's not popularly used because it requires a lot of micro, but the Baneling with Overlords if you're going to have upgrades, not pathogen glands, ventral sacs and pneumatized carapace, you can scoop up your Banelings, and let's say there's, you know, a bunch of units here, and they're, you know, they block themselves. You can drop the Banelings in a kind of a carpet bomb fashion over top of force fields. That used to be very popular in Wings of Liberty. It requires a certain level of micro, plus getting out the upgrades takes a little while. But it is still a very effective strategy, and the way I made the Overlord move while dropping was I moved it, and then I hit D for unload, and clicked on the Overlord. And then you can kind of carpet bomb the sentries that way. So that's it for this video guide. I hope this was helpful for you, and you now know how to counter the Sentry in StarCraft 2.